The Crown versus the Cabinet. A constitutional crisis is unfolding in Britain right now that could change everything we know about the monarchy. Prime Minister Keir Starmer and King Charles are locked in a showdown that historians are calling unprecedented. And what's happening behind palace doors could reshape the very foundation of British democracy. The gloves are off. Tensions are boiling over and the world is watching as two of the most powerful figures in Britain go head-to-head in a battle that nobody saw coming. What triggered this explosive confrontation? Why are insiders calling this the biggest royal crisis since the abdication? And what does this mean for the future of the crown? Stay with me because what I'm about to reveal will shock you. The streets of London are buzzing with whispers of something massive happening behind closed doors. We're talking about a clash that's sending shockwaves through Westminster and Buckingham Palace alike. Sources close to both sides are saying this isn't just a disagreement. This is a full-blown constitutional crisis that could redefine the relationship between the monarchy and the government forever. King Charles, who waited decades to wear the crown, is now facing his first major political storm, and it's not coming from foreign powers or economic collapse. It's coming from his own Prime Minister. Let's rewind for a second and understand how we got here. When Keir Starmer took office, everyone expected a smooth relationship with the palace. After all, Charles has always been known for his progressive views on climate change and social issues, things that align pretty closely with Labour's platform. But here's where things took a dark turn. Intelligence reports started surfacing about disagreements over key policy decisions. We're not talking about minor differences of opinion here. These are fundamental clashes about the direction of the country, about power, about who really calls the shots in modern Britain. And the more you dig into this, the more alarming it becomes. Palace insiders, speaking on condition of anonymity because they fear for their positions, have revealed that the tension started building months ago. It wasn't just one issue, it was a series of escalating confrontations that finally reached a breaking point. The King, using his constitutional rights, has been exercising influence in ways that are making the government extremely uncomfortable. And Starmer, who came into power with a strong mandate for change, isn't backing down. He's pushing back against what he sees as royal overreach, and the collision course was inevitable. The question everyone in Westminster is asking now is this: who will blink first? Here's what makes this situation so explosive. Britain doesn't have a written constitution like America does. Everything runs on precedent, tradition, and unwritten rules that have been respected for centuries. The monarch technically has enormous powers. The king can dissolve parliament, he can refuse to sign laws, he can dismiss the prime minister. But here's the catch: none of these powers have been used in living memory, because everyone understood the unspoken agreement. The crown stays ceremonial and the elected government runs the country. But what happens when that gentleman's agreement breaks down? What happens when a king decides he's not just a figurehead anymore? That's exactly what we're witnessing right now, and it's terrifying. Constitutional scholars across the nation, multiple sources have confirmed that Charles has been using his weekly meetings with the Prime Minister to do more than just listen and advise. He's been actively pushing his own agenda, demanding changes to policies and making it clear that he expects his views to be taken seriously. This isn't the Queen Elizabeth approach of quiet dignity and staying above politics. This is a monarch who believes his experience and his vision matter, and he's not afraid to make that known. Some are calling it refreshing, others are calling it dangerous, but everyone agrees it's unprecedented in modern times. The Prime Minister's office has been scrambling to manage this situation while trying to keep it out of the public eye, but the cracks are starting to show. The first major flashpoint came over environmental policy. Charles has spent his entire adult life championing environmental causes, often ahead of public opinion. He's got strong views about everything from organic farming to renewable energy to urban planning. When Starmer's government proposed new policies that Charles believed didn't go far enough, the King reportedly went ballistic. According to sources who were present at their private meetings, Charles didn't just express concern, he demanded revisions. He used language that made it clear he considered this non-negotiable. For Starmer, this was a red line. He couldn't be seen as taking orders from an unelected monarch, no matter how well-intentioned. His response was reportedly just as forceful. And that's when things started spiralling out of control. But the environmental dispute was just the beginning. The real explosion came over foreign policy decisions that have massive implications for Britain's future. We're talking about relationships with major world powers, trade agreements, defence commitments, the kind of high-stakes diplomacy that shapes a nation's destiny for generations. Charles, with his decades of experience and his network of international contacts, has strong opinions about how Britain should position itself on the world stage. And here's where it gets really complicated. Some of his views apparently conflict directly with the government's strategic direction. When the king started making his positions known, not just privately, but through carefully calculated public statements and royal engagements, alarm bells started ringing throughout Whitehall. The Prime Minister's inner circle began asking themselves a question that seemed unthinkable just months ago. Is the king trying to undermine the elected government? Is he using his platform and his influence to pursue his own foreign policy agenda? And if so, what can they actually do about it? The constitutional tools available to deal with a politically active monarch are murky at best. There's no clear playbook for this situation, and that uncertainty is breeding paranoia and suspicion on both sides. Trust between Number 10 and the palace has completely broken down. Every public appearance by the king is now being scrutinised for hidden meanings. Every policy announcement from the government is being analysed for signs of royal pressure. The situation reached critical mass when leaked documents started appearing in the press. Someone, and nobody knows who, began feeding information to journalists about the private conversations between Charles and Starmer. These weren't just general descriptions of tension, these were detailed accounts of specific exchanges, including direct quotes that were supposed to be completely confidential. The leaks revealed a king who was frustrated, sometimes angry, and determined to make his voice heard. They showed a Prime Minister who was equally determined not to be pushed around by royal pressure. And they exposed a relationship that had deteriorated to the point of barely concealed hostility. When these stories hit the newspapers, all hell broke loose. Both sides immediately launched investigations to find the source of the leaks. The palace suspected elements within the government who wanted to damage the king's reputation and limit his influence. Downing Street suspected royal courtiers who were loyal to Charles and wanted to paint Starmer as weak or disrespectful to the crown. The leak hunt became almost as intense as the original dispute itself. People were being questioned, phone records were being examined, and the atmosphere of paranoia reached levels that veterans of Westminster politics said they'd never seen before. And here's the kicker. The leaks didn't stop. Every few days, new revelations would appear, each one more damaging than the last, each one pushing the crisis deeper into dangerous territory. Public opinion started to divide in ways that surprised everyone. You might think people would automatically side with the elected government over an unelected monarch. But Charles had spent decades building public support for his causes. Many Britons respect his environmental work, his architectural advocacy, his charitable efforts. When polls started coming out, they showed the nation was genuinely split. Some saw Charles as an experienced elder statesman trying to steer the country in the right direction. Others saw him as an out-of-touch aristocrat who didn't understand democratic accountability. The divide wasn't just political. It cut across traditional party lines, across age groups, across every demographic. Britain was literally splitting into pro-Charles and pro-Starmer camps. And the rhetoric on both sides was getting heated. Parliament couldn't stay silent forever. Opposition MPs started asking pointed questions. During Prime Minister's questions, they wanted to know if reports of friction with the palace were true. They wanted to know if the king was interfering in government business. They wanted to know what the Prime Minister was doing about it. Starmer, trapped between the need to defend his authority and the impossibility of openly criticising the monarch, gave evasive answers that satisfied nobody. His responses were carefully worded to avoid constitutional landmines, but they came across as weak and defensive. The opposition smelled blood in the water. They began to paint Starmer as someone who had lost control, who couldn't manage his relationship with the king, who was letting the crown dictate terms to the elected government. Behind the scenes, senior figures in both camps were desperately trying to find a way out of this mess. Experienced constitutional experts were being consulted. Former prime ministers who had dealt with the late Queen were being asked for advice. Legal scholars were being brought in to analyse exactly what powers the king did and didn't have. But every conversation seemed to make things worse rather than better, because the fundamental question at the heart of this crisis has no easy answer. In a constitutional monarchy, what happens when the monarch and the government fundamentally disagree about the direction of the country? Who has the final say? And what mechanisms exist to resolve the dispute without triggering a full constitutional meltdown? Nobody had good answers because this situation simply hasn't happened in modern Britain. The international dimension added another layer of complexity. Foreign governments were watching this crisis with intense interest. Britain's allies were worried about instability in a key democratic partner. Britain's competitors were enjoying the spectacle of a major Western democracy tearing itself apart from within. Diplomatic cables obtained through sources revealed that ambassadors from multiple countries had reported back to their capitals expressing concern about Britain's ability to maintain policy continuity when the head of state and the head of government were openly at odds. Some foreign leaders were reportedly asking their advisors a simple question: if we make an agreement with the British government, will the king try to undermine it? That's the kind of reputational damage that takes decades to repair. Charles himself was facing pressure from within the royal family. Other senior royals, including those who remembered how carefully Elizabeth navigated political waters, were reportedly advising him to step back, to remember the lessons of constitutional monarchy, to avoid destroying the careful balance that had kept the institution relevant and respected. But Charles, according to those who know him well, believed this was his moment. He'd waited his entire life to be king. He'd developed strong convictions about the challenges facing Britain and the world, and he wasn't about to waste his reign sitting silently while decisions he considered wrong were made in his name. This wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. In Charles's mind, this was duty. This was using his position to do what he believed was right, and that conviction made compromise almost impossible. The crisis took another turn when rumours began circulating about nuclear options being considered on both sides. On the government side, whispers emerged about potential legislation that could further limit royal powers, making them even more ceremonial than they already were in practice. Some backbench MPs, emboldened by the crisis, started talking openly about whether Britain even needed a monarchy anymore. For the first time in generations, serious politicians were discussing republicanism not as a fringe idea, but as a legitimate option. On the palace side, equally disturbing rumours suggested that Charles was receiving advice about his theoretical power to dissolve Parliament if he felt the government had lost its way. The idea was almost unthinkable, but the fact that it was even being discussed showed how far off the rails this situation had gone. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a major public event with cameras rolling and the world watching, a moment occurred that made the private warfare public in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. The exact details are still emerging, but witnesses describe a tense exchange between the king and the prime minister that was visible to everyone in attendance. Body language experts analysing the footage pointed out signs of barely concealed animosity. Lip readers claim to decipher heated words being exchanged. Social media exploded with speculation and accusations. The Palace and Downing Street both rushed out statements claiming everything was fine, but nobody believed them. The fiction that this was all friendly disagreement had been shattered. Britain and the world could now see clearly that the King and the Prime Minister were in open conflict. The fallout was immediate and severe. The pound dropped on currency markets as investors worried about British political stability. Opposition parties called emergency debates demanding answers. Senior members of Starmer's own party began privately questioning whether this crisis was becoming ungovernable, and polling showed public concern about the situation, reaching levels that political analysts called dangerous for both the government and the monarchy. Everyone understood that this couldn't continue. Something had to give. Either there would be a climb down from one side or both, or Britain was heading toward a constitutional showdown that could fundamentally alter the nature of its government. Emergency meetings were convened at the highest levels. The Archbishop of Canterbury, traditionally a mediator in times of national crisis, was reportedly brought in to facilitate dialogue. Senior judges were consulted about the legal parameters of the situation. Former prime ministers from both parties offered their services as intermediaries. Everyone understood the stakes. If this crisis wasn't resolved, the damage to British institutions could be irreparable. The monarchy could lose its remaining public support and face calls for abolition. The government could be seen as weak and ineffective, unable to govern effectively. Parliament itself could be drawn into a constitutional battle that would paralyse the legislative process. Everything that made British democracy function was at risk. What happened next in those private negotiations may not be fully known for years, maybe decades. But sources close to the talks describe them as brutal, emotional, and unlike anything in modern British political history. Both sides had to confront fundamental questions about power, duty, and the nature of their roles. Charles had to decide whether pushing his agenda was worth potentially destroying the institution he'd inherited. Starmer had to decide whether standing firm against royal pressure was worth triggering a constitutional crisis that could consume his premiership. Neither man wanted to be remembered as the one who broke the British constitutional system, but neither was willing to simply surrender their position. The compromise that eventually emerged, if you can call it that, satisfied nobody completely. Details remain sketchy because both sides have reasons to keep the exact terms private. But the general outline involves Charles agreeing to step back from certain areas of policy, while Starmer's government commits to consulting more seriously with the palace on issues where royal expertise and experience could be valuable. It's a fragile arrangement, built more on mutual exhaustion than genuine agreement. Both sides are claiming victory while privately nursing grievances and resentments that won't disappear anytime soon. The question now is whether this arrangement will hold or whether it's just a temporary pause in a longer struggle for power and influence. The long-term implications of this crisis are still unfolding. Constitutional experts are already calling for reforms to clarify the relationship between Crown and government. Some are proposing written constitutional amendments that would make explicit what has always been implicit. Others argue that Britain's strength has always been its flexibility, and that codifying everything would create more problems than it solves. Public debate about the role of monarchy in modern democracy has been reignited in ways not seen since the aftermath of Princess Diana's death. Younger Britons especially are questioning whether an hereditary monarch makes sense in the 21st century. Support for republicanism hasn't become majority opinion, but it's grown significantly, and that trend is worrying for the palace. For Starmer, this crisis has been a baptism of fire that has aged him visibly. Close observers note how much more guarded he's become, how carefully he now weighs every public statement, how aware he is of the constitutional minefields surrounding him. His relationship with Charles will never be easy or trusting, but both men now understand the boundaries better. They've tested each other's limits and found where the real red lines are. Whether they can work together effectively going forward remains an open question. Every interaction between them will be scrutinised for signs of renewed tension. Every policy decision will be analysed for evidence of royal influence or resistance to it. For Charles, this has been the defining crisis of his early reign. He came to the throne with grand ambitions and strong convictions about how he could make a difference. This showdown has taught him harsh lessons about the limits of royal power in a democracy. Some see a king who's been humbled and brought back to earth. Others see a monarch who successfully asserted himself and proved he wouldn't be a mere rubber stamp. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Charles has influence but not control. He has a voice, but not a veto, and navigating that distinction will define the rest of his reign. The question is whether he's learnt enough from this crisis to avoid future collisions, or whether his fundamental personality and convictions will inevitably lead to more confrontations down the road. The British public has been watching all of this with a mixture of fascination, concern, and confusion. Many people feel whiplashed by the rapid developments and the competing narratives. Trust in both the monarchy and the government has taken hits that will take time to repair. There's a sense that the curtain has been pulled back and people have seen the messy reality of how power actually works in Britain. And for some, that's been disillusioning. The image of dignified constitutional harmony has been replaced by the reality of human beings with egos and agendas fighting over influence and control. That's a more honest picture, perhaps, but it's also a more troubling one for those who want to believe in the majesty and stability of British institutions. As we watch this situation continue to develop, one thing is clear. Britain has been through a constitutional crisis that will be studied and debated for generations. The relationship between King Charles and Prime Minister Starmer has become a case study in what happens when constitutional conventions are tested to their breaking point, whether this leads to needed reforms and clarifications, or whether it's just the first battle in a longer war for the soul of British democracy. Only time will tell. What we know for certain is that the gentleman's agreement that kept the monarchy and government in balance for so long has been severely tested, and things will never quite be the same again. The Crown and the Cabinet